right, let's tackle the fifth objective for Unit 1. This is where you should be able to describe the relationship between increasing or decreasing plant nutrient concentration on plant yield with respect to both nutrient deficiencies and toxicities. I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible and use this graph. This graph is also shown in your notes. And this graph shows you 5 locations that we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss, well, first of all, what this graph shows you before I talk about what we're going to discuss is it shows you the nutrient concentration in the tissue for any nutrient versus relative plant yield. And this ties directly to the Justus von Liebig's law of the minimum. When a nutrient is deficient, the plant relative growth suffers. So we have a zone called the deficient zone that increases as you increase nutrient concentration or fertilizer use or an amendment that supplies nutrients to a soil. Then there comes a point on this curve where there's a transition zone or critical range or critical zone. We might just call it for this class critical range or transition. This is an area where you're between about 90 to 100% relative crop growth or crop yield. And this area is where if you add a little bit more fertilizer, you don't see a great return on investment in terms of output from a system. Then there's the sufficient zone, and this really should be drawn as a flat line. Sorry, it's not. I'm not an artist, unfortunately. I'm a scientist, but this is a flat line. And so the sufficient zone is where if you add any more of a nutrient, you do not see a boost in yield. In fact, this might be something that is, or an area is called, you may have heard luxury consumption, where the plant may take up more nutrients because it's luxurious, but it's not benefiting the plant at all, and it's not benefiting the output. Then there's another zone where the toxicity kicks in, where the nutrient is just excessive or toxic to a plant. And when you're in this zone where yield decreases, what happens is oftentimes the concentration of a nutrient is so great that it kills the growing tip of the root, the apical meristem. We're going to talk about this in the last unit, hopefully, if we get to it. And then there's this other region in plant concentration or plant growth called the Steenberg effect. And this is simply when the nutrient concentrations are just so low that the concentration of nutrients concentrates within the plant. You hardly ever see this effect, but we're still going to talk about it. So let's talk about the specific regions, and let's start with the deficient zone first. The deficient zone is an area where this curve, as you increase nutrient concentration in the tissue via adding a nutrient to a soil, the curve increases linearly. This is the deficient zone. This zone is low enough to severely limit crop growth or yield. And it's interesting to note that you may or you may not see a deficiency symptom in a plant. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And it makes it a challenge for diagnosing the deficiency. It's not impossible, but it makes it difficult. Okay, so that's the deficient zone. The crop yield is severely limiting due to the lack of a nutrient or nutrients. Let's talk about the critical range. The critical range is the nutrient concentration below which yield response occurs, right? So at the inflection point on this curve where my arrow is, below this point, you're going to see a yield response. Above this point, you may or may not see a yield response, but the inflection point here usually equates to about 90% of maximum plant growth or yield. And from this inflection point over to where the line flatlines essentially is also known as the transition zone. Let's talk about the third location or zone, the sufficient zone. The sufficient zone is the nutrient concentration range where if you added any additional nutrient, you're not going to see a yield increase. Sometimes people call this an area of luxury consumption. I mentioned that on the previous slide. And if you are a farmer or a producer, you likely wouldn't want to be way out here in the sufficient zone because you're applying fertilizers, which are currently costly, and you're not getting any return on your investment. Now let's talk about the fourth zone. This is the excessive or toxic zone. This is where concentrations of necessary plant nutrients are high enough to limit plant growth and yield, right? So there are nutrients that are present in the soil that are toxic that kill the apical meristem or the growing tip of the root and prevent the plant from growing below ground. And subsequently, you see this effect above ground. Now let's talk about this Steenberg effect. The Steenberg effect is where you have low nutrient supply that limits plant growth, and thus you concentrate plant nutrients in smaller plants. And what this effect results in is an increase in nutrient concentrations in spite of the nutrient deficiency. So the plants are so small that they're stunted, and thus the nutrients are concentrated to a greater degree within the plant itself. To be honest, you do see this in plants, and sometimes you see it in the deficient zone, but oftentimes it's pronounced in the Steenberg effect area. And I hope that makes sense. So if you have a very, very small plant, the nutrients are just simply more concentrated, and the relative yield is almost non-existent, which is not what we want when we're trying to feed 8 billion people on the face of the planet. So, with that stated, where are all these necessary nutrients for plant growth going to come from? They come from soils, right? So they come from the minerals that are present in soils that are degraded over time due to simply weathering and degradation due to abiotic factors and biotic factors. They come from organic matter or organic materials that are degraded by microorganisms over time. And they come from the decomposition of plant materials that are reapplied year after year after year if you're in, say, like a perennial system like you see in my background here. Or if you're adding crop residues year after year after year and not removing them from the soil. These are where these minerals or necessary nutrients for plant growth are going to come from. They also come from the atmosphere and they come from water. So they come from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and they come from water in the form of precipitation or irrigation. And when we're lacking in the system, they come from fertilizers as well as potentially soil amendments. So let me give you a hypothetical situation. And this graph, to be honest with you, it's pretty cheesy, but it's hypothetical and it drives home a good point as to what we do in soil fertility management to manage systems to grow plants or crops. And this is what we do. So let me give you a hypothetical situation, and we'll just look at this figure here. Here's the fertility status of any given soil, low, medium, or high, in general statements, okay? And so if a soil has a low fertility status, the light blue color, in order to supply the necessary nutrients for plant growth, we apply either an amendment, or this should also say up here in this dark blue box, a fertilizer. And we typically apply these in greater quantities. If the soil fertility status is, say, medium, then we can apply less fertilizer or less amendment. And if the fertility status is high, we don't need to add anything. And this is what scientists and producers are trying to do more and more each and every day and every year, is to get to the point where the fertility status is either high or medium high and not low. So the fertility of a soil is coming from the soil itself and not from external inputs. And you probably know that external inputs are very expensive currently. So let me show you some graphs. Right, so this is a graph or a table based on results from soil submitted to commercial laboratories across the US. And if you look at the main macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium listed here, the percent of tested soils that fall into these three different categories of low, medium, and high. For nitrogen, oftentimes we fall into the low category. And so we need to offset our needs of, or crop, not our needs, but plant needs of nitrogen with fertilizers or amendments. And I showed you this in some subsequent graphs, which were looking at the use of nitrogen not only in the US, but globally. And this is king. Nitrogen use is king on a global basis. Phosphorus, it's almost evenly split, and it really depends on a number of different factors. For example, how much phosphorus is present in a system? Is it locked up in a mineral phase, or is it available for plants? And it varies. All right, so it's not quite evenly split, but it's kind of evenly split. Potassium, on the other hand, most often we're in the high category, and other soils fall within the low and medium, but often we're in the high category. Now, that's not always the case. All right, and this is not always the case, and these three rows are not set in stone. So I want to share with you some graphs. And these are some recent graphs taken from the Fertilizer Institute. And this first graph or picture of the US shows you the nutrient needs of phosphorus across the US. This is a graph from 2020, and these are the percentages of samples tested within each one of these states that tested below the critical phosphorus level for plants within those states. And so what you see is quite a range, right? So if you look back on the table I just shared with you, phosphorus was relatively even across the board in terms of low, medium, and high. But that's not really the story. And if you look at across the US, it varies, but it's sort of even, not quite, but sort of even, right? Some states require more phosphorus because they're below the test value, like Texas, for example, or Montana. Here's Texas, here's Montana. But other states like Ohio, for example, about 50% test below. And so those soils likely need some phosphorus. Here's another figure. This is potassium. And on the table in your notes, potassium oftentimes falls within 90% or the high category, or 90% in the high category. But that's not always the case. So if you look across the United States, what we typically see is, unfortunately, some of the Western United States are not listed, but oftentimes west of the Mississippi or even further west, we don't need potassium in our soils out west because our soils contain plenty of potassium from the mineral phases that are present in soils in the Western US. Those minerals have been weathered out of soils on the eastern United States, and thus our soils along the eastern corridor tend to require some potassium. And so you see the numbers are greater here. The next graph shows you sulfur. And these are sulfur requirements and the needs of sulfur across the US. And you can see that sulfur is not really needed in great quantities in most states. And that's because our soils tend to contain enough sulfur to supply the sulfur needs for plants. In fact, here in Ohio, or in this area of the US, the sulfur needs are oftentimes not needed at all. And this is some work that came out of Laura Lindsay's group recently at The Ohio State University in conjunction with other universities, whereby they looked at a number of different soybean plants and the needs for sulfur. And oftentimes, probably 96% sulfur wasn't needed in the plants grown in our region. And this is the last slide for Unit 1. This is the needs for zinc across the US. So the percentages of soils that tested below the threshold needs for zinc. And you can see that zinc is needed all across the US. We've done a very good job of mining zinc out of our soils from historic crop growth. And thus we simply need zinc for crop growth across the US. So That's the end of Unit 1.